For years, I had enjoyed the simple pleasures of living in our quiet suburban neighborhood. The small lake at its center was the jewel of the community, calm, serene, and perfect for fishing or just unwinding by the water's edge. Every weekend, without fail, I'd pack my fishing gear and spend a few hours casting lines, hoping for a catch or just enjoying the peace. It was my escape from the chaos of work and the relentless pace of modern life. The neighborhood was tight-knit. Neighbors waved at one another, children played in the yards, and everything seemed safe and familiar. One bright Saturday morning, I woke early, as usual. The sun was just cresting the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the lake's glassy surface. I grabbed my fishing rod, a small tackle box, and a folding chair, then headed out to my favorite spot on the shore, a small inlet shaded by towering oak trees. I set up quietly, careful not to disturb the stillness, and cast my line into the water, feeling the comforting weight of the rod and the cool breeze on my face. Minutes passed, then an hour, then two. I caught a few small bass and bluegill, feeling the familiar rush when the line tugged. Everything was perfect. Later that afternoon, as I was packing up to head home, I noticed a small envelope taped to the trunk of the oak tree where I'd parked my bike. Curious, I opened it and found a crisp letter from the Homeowners Association. It was a fine notice, $250 for violating community rules by fishing in the lake without prior permission. The letter was stern, quoting the HOA's bylaws and emphasizing the importance of maintaining order and protecting community resources. I was stunned. I had lived here for nearly a decade and never heard of such a rule, let alone a fine for fishing. I called the HOA office immediately, hoping to clarify or dispute the charge. The receptionist was polite but firm. Fishing was only allowed for residents who had purchased a special permit, which I hadn't. She offered no flexibility, and the board members I spoke to later were even less understanding. Rules are rules, they said. You should have known better. It felt like a petty move, as if the HOA was trying to assert its power over trivial matters. I had paid my dues, contributed to community events, and respected every rule, until now, when they seemed intent on punishing me unfairly. Over the next week, I spoke with neighbors. Some sympathized quietly, others shrugged it off as the way things are. A few mentioned they'd heard rumors of the HOA cracking down on lake usage, but had never been fined themselves. The sense of frustration grew inside me, a burning resentment against the faceless board that seemed more interested in control than community. I reviewed the HOA documents, searching for loopholes or inconsistencies. The lake's ownership was vague. Was it truly owned by the HOA, or was it public land? If it belonged to all residents, how could they restrict access? If privately owned, by whom? The questions gnawed at me. This incident, which had begun as a minor irritation, soon consumed my thoughts. Fishing had always been my peaceful hobby, but now it symbolized something larger, a fight for fairness, respect, and autonomy. I decided I wouldn't pay the fine without a fight. I consulted a lawyer specializing in property and community law, who told me that the HOA's claim might not be as solid as they thought. There were potential flaws in their ownership of the lake and their ability to regulate it. Encouraged, I dug deeper. The idea slowly took root in my mind. What if I could own the lake myself? What if I could take control of the property they use to intimidate residents? It sounded crazy at first. A lake isn't like a house or a condo unit. But the more I researched, the more it seemed possible. The lake was part of a larger parcel that had not been fully transferred to the HOA when the neighborhood was developed. The original landowner still had a stake, and I might be able to buy it from them. The thought energized me. I began contacting real estate agents, landowners, and legal experts, setting a plan in motion. The process wasn't easy. Negotiations dragged on for months. I faced skepticism, bureaucratic hurdles, and more than a few outright refusals. The seller was a private entity with little interest in dealing with neighborhood politics, but curious about the financial offer. Meanwhile, the HOA board grew more hostile when they learned of my moves, warning me to back off. I refused. This wasn't just about fishing anymore. It was about standing up to what felt like unfair tyranny. Eventually, after countless meetings, paperwork, and financial planning, I sealed the deal. The lake and its surrounding land were officially mine. The moment I signed the papers, a wave of satisfaction washed over me. I had turned a petty conflict into a decisive victory. But with ownership came new challenges and decisions. How would I manage the lake? What rules would I impose? How would the neighborhood react when I told them they were no longer welcome? I prepared to make the announcement, knowing it would shock everyone. My plan was clear. No more unauthorized fishing, no more HOA interference. If the board wanted to dictate lake usage, they'd have to do it through me. The power dynamics had shifted dramatically. I had bought the lake, and with it, I bought control. Owning the lake was a victory, but it came with an unexpected weight. The day I received the deed felt surreal, as if the quiet suburban world I'd known had shifted on its axis. The water that once seemed just a backdrop to weekend afternoons now held the full power of ownership, a tangible asset with the potential to redefine the neighborhood's social fabric. Walking along the shore, I felt the breeze whispering through the reeds, the sunlight glinting on ripples, and in that moment, a strange sense of responsibility settled in my chest. This lake, this place I had always taken for granted, was now mine to protect and shape. I spent days planning my next move. First, I crafted a formal letter addressed to every resident in the community. It explained, in firm but respectful language, that the lake was now private property under my ownership, effective immediately. I laid out the new rules: no fishing, swimming, boating, or any recreational use without express permission. Trespassers would be subject to prosecution. I wanted to be clear that this wasn't personal vendetta. It was a matter of legal rights and respect for private property. When the letters went out, the neighborhood's atmosphere shifted overnight. Conversations buzzed at block parties, on social media, and in doorways. Some neighbors were outraged, claiming I was selfish and overstepping bounds. Others quietly expressed support, whispering that the HOA had been too harsh for too long. The board itself was livid. I got calls from angry members, demanding meetings, attempting to intimidate me into reversing the ban. But I stood firm. The first few days were tense. I hired a small security team to patrol the area and monitor unauthorized activity around the lake. At first, the presence of guards was met with suspicion and resentment, but soon it became clear that the message was serious. The lake was off limits. A few daring neighbors tried to sneak in during early mornings or late evenings, hoping to reclaim a piece of what they considered their own. Each time, they were politely but firmly escorted off the property. One neighbor even challenged me face to face, arguing passionately that the lake belonged to the whole community, that I was being selfish. I listened calmly, explained my position, but refused to back down. That confrontation was a turning point. It made me realize how deeply some residents felt about the lake, not just as a physical space, but as a symbol of community and shared life. Yet the HOA had shown its hand long ago, wielding rules to exclude and punish. I had only responded in kind, taking control where they had failed. Still, I began thinking about how to use the lake to bring people together, but on my own terms. Over the next few months, I invested in improving the lake's surroundings. The docks were repaired, picnic areas cleared, trails cleaned, and enhanced with benches and signs. But access remained restricted. Only invited guests could enjoy the facilities. Slowly, I began hosting private fishing tournaments, small barbecues, and family days for friends and neighbors who respected the new boundaries. It was a way to show that ownership wasn't about exclusion, but about respect and stewardship. Meanwhile, the HOA board's power waned. Without control of the lake, one of their major tools for influence was gone. Some board members resigned, frustrated and humiliated. The neighborhood's social structure began to realign. Some residents who had blindly followed the HOA's strict rules started questioning authority, seeing the lake as a reminder of what could be taken away or reclaimed. Others remained bitter, refusing to accept the change. Through it all, I learned a lot about community dynamics, power, and human nature. What started as a simple fishing trip turned into a saga about ownership, rights, and standing up for oneself against arbitrary rules. The lake wasn't just water and land anymore. It was a symbol of my determination and resilience. I hadn't set out to be a disruptor, but sometimes standing your ground means shaking the very foundations of what you thought was stable. Looking back, the fine from the HOA was just the spark that ignited a much bigger fire. If I hadn't challenged it, I would have remained a passive player, accepting the rules without question. But by pushing back, I opened a door to possibilities I never imagined: buying the lake, redefining community norms, and reclaiming a sense of control in a world that often feels governed by faceless bureaucracies. The neighborhood may never be the same, but neither am I. I now see property, community, and power through a different lens. That quiet lake, once a simple fishing spot, became a battleground and ultimately a monument to standing up for what's rightfully yours. Step 2. The neighborhood's backlash and the battle for control. After the announcement that I had purchased the lake and was banning the entire neighborhood from using it, the atmosphere around the community changed drastically. What was once a friendly, peaceful area with neighbors casually greeting one another became a tinderbox of whispered conversations, glares exchanged in passing, and increasingly hostile interactions. The HOA board, blindsided and humiliated by my move, was desperate to regain control or at least undermine my authority. But legally, their hands were tied. I was now the sole owner of the lake and all the property around it, and the bylaws they enforced before no longer applied to me or to my land. The first few days after sending the ban notice, I received a flood of angry phone calls and emails. Some neighbors tried to reason, pleading for compromises or permits to continue fishing and swimming. Others outright threatened legal action or warned of collective retaliation. But I remained steadfast, emphasizing that this was my legal right and trespassers would face consequences. I even involved a local law enforcement liaison to make sure that any enforcement of trespassing laws would be fair but firm. I wasn't interested in escalating into violence or chaos. I just wanted respect for my property. Meanwhile, the HOA board launched a campaign to sway public opinion. They posted flyers around the neighborhood, held emergency meetings, and sent mass emails condemning what they called a hostile takeover. Some residents, especially older ones who had long supported the HOA's authority, saw me as a disruptive force, someone who cared more about power than community harmony. The local newspaper caught wind of the story and ran a feature titled "Lake Owner versus Neighborhood, a Battle Over Community Space," which only fanned the flames. Opinions were sharply divided. Some praised my courage to stand up to the HOA's tyranny. Others lamented the loss of a shared resource. Tensions escalated when a group of about a dozen residents organized a protest outside my property line. They held signs demanding access, chanting slogans about community rights and shared resources. I watched from my porch as police monitored the peaceful but tense gathering. I understood their frustration, but I also knew that from a legal standpoint, the lake was private property now. The protest, while loud, didn't change the reality of ownership. One night I found trespassers fishing illegally on the lake. They had sneaked in through a gap in the fence. I called security, who confronted the group and escorted them off the property. This incident was a clear message. I wasn't bluffing. Trespassing would not be tolerated. The neighbors involved filed complaints, but the authorities upheld my right to protect my land. The HOA board's influence continued to diminish, and some members resigned quietly, unwilling to be associated with the failed effort to maintain control. Despite the conflict, I sought ways to bridge the gap. I started holding invitation-only community events by the lake, inviting residents who demonstrated respect and willingness to coexist peacefully. These gatherings were small at first, with fishing tournaments for a few families and cookouts with close friends. The lake slowly transformed from a battleground into a private retreat that fostered new kinds of relationships based on choice and respect rather than obligation or HOA decree. However, the division within the neighborhood was palpable. Some residents felt alienated, shut out from what they had once seen as their community resource. There were whispered plans among certain factions to pool resources and buy the lake from me, hoping to restore access to all. But I had no intention of selling. The lake represented far more than real estate. It was a symbol of my fight for fairness and autonomy. As weeks turned into months, the neighborhood began to adjust. The initial hostility faded into cautious coexistence. I kept investing in the lake's upkeep and improved the surrounding land, adding new benches, better lighting, and secure docks. I also implemented an online system where residents could request access for special occasions, fishing days, family picnics, but only those who agreed to follow strict rules were granted permission. This system was a compromise that allowed some controlled sharing while maintaining the integrity of my ownership and the ban. Looking back, I realized that this ordeal had reshaped not only the neighborhood, but also my own perspective on community, ownership, and power. What started as a simple dispute over fishing had become a profound lesson in standing up for one's rights, navigating social conflict, and redefining the meaning of shared spaces. The lake was no longer just a body of water. It was a battleground, a sanctuary, and a symbol of change. Step 3. Unexpected alliances and the new order. Months had passed since I had purchased the lake and imposed the ban on the entire neighborhood. The initial shockwaves had settled into a new, uneasy normal. The lake was quiet again, peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced before. With fewer people using it, the water's surface reflected the sky more clearly, and the wildlife that had fled during the chaos was slowly returning. I had made significant improvements, rebuilt the docks, cleared trails, installed better lighting, and even planted trees and flowers along the shoreline. The lake had become a private sanctuary, a place where I could escape the noise of both the neighborhood and the disputes that had rocked the community. Yet, despite my efforts to create a peaceful retreat, the neighborhood was far from harmonious. The HOA, though weakened, continued to fume in the background. They had stopped public protests, but their influence lingered. Some residents held on to resentment, refusing to accept the new reality. There were whispers of legal challenges and plans to appeal to city authorities to force public access. But the legal advice I had secured assured me my ownership was solid. The lake was mine, and the law was on my side. Amid this tension, something unexpected happened. A small group of neighbors, who had been skeptical or even hostile at first, began reaching out to me privately. These were not the loudest or most confrontational residents, but rather those who quietly questioned the HOA's heavy-handedness from the start. They saw in me not just a disruptor, but a protector of fairness and property rights. They expressed appreciation for the improvements I'd made and the way I was open to dialogue, albeit with firm boundaries. One evening, I invited a few of these neighbors for a casual gathering by the lake. We sat around a fire pit, sharing stories and perspectives. They spoke about their frustrations with the HOA's past overreach, their hopes for a community built on mutual respect rather than strict control, and their interest in contributing to the upkeep and responsible use of the lake. It was clear that despite the divisions, there was room to build new kinds of alliances, not based on old rules, but on shared values and trust. Encouraged by this, I proposed forming a voluntary lake committee made up of residents who would work with me to maintain the property and organize controlled access events. The idea was met with cautious optimism. This group wouldn't have decision-making power over the lake's ownership, but it would serve as a bridge between me and the neighborhood, ensuring that voices were heard and activities were coordinated responsibly. It was a compromise that balanced my need for control with the community's desire for inclusion. Together, we established guidelines for access, scheduled fishing days with limited permits, and planned cleanup events to preserve the lake's natural beauty. The committee helped mediate disputes, manage requests, and keep the peace. Slowly, the lake's identity began to shift again, not back to the uncontrolled communal space it once was, but into something new, a privately owned resource managed with community input and respect. The HOA board, though still bitter, found their role diminished. Without control over the lake, they struggled to rally support or enforce many of their old rules. Some members tried to organize opposition to the new committee, accusing it of undermining neighborhood unity. But many residents welcomed the change, tired of endless HOA politics and eager for practical solutions. Meanwhile, my relationship with the neighbors evolved. Some friendships formed, based on mutual respect and shared stewardship of the lake. Others remained distant, wary of what the lake represented, a symbol of my victory and their exclusion. But even those who stayed on the sidelines respected the order we'd created and the benefits it brought. A cleaner, safer, and better managed lake than ever before. On a personal level, the experience transformed me. I learned that power isn't just about control or ownership. It's about responsibility, communication, and sometimes compromise. Buying the lake was a bold, disruptive act, but keeping it required diplomacy and openness. I realized that true leadership means listening as much as asserting rights, and that communities thrive not through domination, but through cooperation. The lake, once a simple fishing spot, had become a microcosm of broader societal struggles between individual rights and collective good, authority and freedom, exclusion and inclusion. It was a lesson in how property, power, and people intersect in complex and often unpredictable ways. Step 4. Sabotage, standoffs, and the fight to protect what's mine. Despite months of relative calm and the creation of the voluntary lake committee, the reality was that not everyone in the neighborhood accepted the new order. Beneath the surface of polite smiles and hesitant cooperation, resentment simmered. A faction of neighbors remained vehemently opposed to my ownership of the lake, seeing it as an affront to their community identity and a symbol of greed and exclusion. These tensions came to a head one late summer evening. I was at the lake, inspecting the docks after a routine maintenance check, when I noticed something off. A few piles of trash scattered along the shoreline, signs of someone trying to send a message. More alarming were the damaged sections of the fence that I had carefully installed to mark the property line and keep trespassers out. It was clear someone had deliberately vandalized it. I called my security team, who confirmed that the damage was recent and intentional. It wasn't just petty mischief. This was sabotage. The message was unmistakable. Someone was challenging my authority and was willing to break the law to make their point. The neighborhood had crossed a dangerous line. The following days saw escalating acts of defiance. Unauthorized parties were held by the lake, bonfires lit, and fishing lines cast without permission. On one occasion, a group of masked individuals was caught attempting to remove one of the docks. It felt like a battle zone rather than the peaceful retreat I'd worked so hard to create. I responded firmly. Security patrols were increased, surveillance cameras installed, and I engaged local law enforcement more directly. Trespassers were prosecuted, and community warnings were issued. But beyond enforcement, I sought to understand what was fueling such hostility. The lake had become a symbol in a deeper struggle between control and freedom, tradition and change. A confrontation with a small group of protesters crystallized this. They argued passionately that the lake had been a communal space for decades and that no single individual had the right to exclude everyone else. Their anger was raw, fueled by a sense of loss and betrayal. I listened, trying to explain my position calmly, that my ownership was lawful, that I wanted to manage the lake responsibly, and that the new system wasn't about exclusion, but about respect and order. But reason only went so far. The emotional weight of the issue ran deep. For some neighbors, the lake represented memories, childhoods, family traditions, things that couldn't be easily replaced or redefined. Their resistance was as much about preserving identity as it was about access. To address this, I doubled down on community engagement. I held open forums, invited feedback, and expanded the Lake Committee's role to include more voices and broader responsibilities. We created a system for granting special access for important family events or neighborhood gatherings, carefully balancing inclusion with security. Gradually, these efforts began to ease tensions, but not eliminate them. There were still those who refused to accept the new reality, who plotted to reclaim the lake by force or sabotage. I had to remain vigilant, protecting what was legally mine while trying to maintain peace. This experience was a harsh lesson in the complexities of ownership and community. Property lines on a map don't just separate land, they divide histories, emotions, and loyalties. The fight for the lake became a fight for respect, recognition, and a place in the neighborhood story. Despite the challenges, I remained determined. The lake was more than a piece of land. It was a testament to standing up for one's rights, for creating order in chaos, and for building a new kind of community based on respect rather than fear. Step 5. The resolution and new beginning. After months of tension, conflicts, and tough decisions, the lake and the neighborhood finally settled into a new chapter. The battles over ownership, access, and control had shaped everyone involved, myself included. What started as a simple dispute over a fishing fine had grown into a profound journey about rights, community, and the meaning of home. The acts of sabotage and protests slowly diminished as more neighbors saw the benefits of a well-maintained lake under responsible ownership. The voluntary Lake Committee grew stronger, its members serving as a bridge between me and the community, easing fears and fostering cooperation. Special access days became traditions, fishing tournaments, family picnics, and quiet evenings where respectful neighbors could enjoy the lake's beauty without conflict. The HOA, once so powerful, was a shadow of its former self. Their attempts to reclaim control or undermine my ownership failed repeatedly, and many board members quietly stepped down. The neighborhood's social fabric shifted, with people choosing to collaborate rather than confront. Through it all, I reflected on what the lake had come to represent. It was more than water and land. It was a symbol of standing up for oneself, the importance of boundaries, and the possibility of change. I had learned that ownership comes with responsibility, not just to property, but to people. True power lies in balancing firmness with empathy, in creating spaces where rights and respect coexist. As spring turned to summer, I stood on the dock watching the sunset, surrounded by neighbors who had once opposed me, but now shared quiet moments of peace by the water. The lake sparkled with a calm that felt hard-earned and deeply rewarding. The journey had been difficult, but it had also brought unexpected friendships, new perspectives, and a stronger sense of community, even if that community looked different than before. In the end, owning the lake was more than a victory. It was a new beginning. The neighborhood wasn't the same as it had been, and neither was I. We had all grown through conflict and compromise, learning that sometimes standing your ground leads to the kind of change that reshapes everything. The lake remained mine, protected and cherished, but it also belonged to the stories we all shared. Stories of challenge, resilience, and the complicated, beautiful nature of community.